Okay, welcome to Chapter 6, Recognizing, Analyzing, and Constructing Arguments. Let's jump in. So, arguments and issues, it's really important that you forget the idea that an argument is something that you get into that is a conflict and the goal is to win. For the purpose of this course, arguments help us analyze issues to assess whether a position on an issue is reasonable or unreasonable. And an issue is defined as a complex problem involving a controversy. Identifying an issue requires asking the right questions as well as having good communication skills. So here's an example. Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954. What is the issue in this photograph? We have a bunch of white people in the background screaming and yelling. You can see there's some military in the top left-hand corner. And the issue is whether African Americans and white people should go to school together. That's the issue. And there's arguments on both sides. There's arguments saying that school should be integrated because it's better for everyone else in society and the country as a whole. And then there's an argument that whites and blacks and other minorities should be separated with education. And what is so fascinating about this picture is it was 50 years ago that this decision was made in the US. And still today, and especially over the last year, we have seen that this remains an issue. And maybe not necessarily the integration of schools, but definitely there are numerous race issues bubbling up in the States and North America as a whole. So this is a complex issue. Abraham Lincoln, was his decision to stand by his conclusion that slavery should be illegal a wise one? Are there times when it is best to back down from an argument rather than risk conflict? I think the older you get, the more you realize that for some arguments, it's probably better to back down than to create conflict. Because either you're dealing with the side that you know is entrenched and that you will have no real opportunity convincing them. And I'm not talking about big, broad societal issues like racism. I'm talking about maybe what you're going to have for dinner or what you're going to do with your plans on Saturday. It's not always beneficial to create conflict over small issues. So rhetoric is, on the other hand, what we normally think of as arguments, because rhetoric's goal is to win. And it's a defensive position. It's a position in which you're trying to win, in which you don't really consider the other side. In contrast, argumentation, what you're trying to do is discover the truth. You're trying to look at issues, complex issues, simple issues, and figure out what is the truth. So I had a student once that tried to convince me, they argued, that we should be able to hunt endangered species. And so the issue was the extinction of species on this planet. And the argument went, if we allow to legally hunt certain endangered species, and we provide a tag, which is permission to kill that animal, and we charge tens of thousands of dollars for that, people will pay for that. And then you use that money to go into the conservation and protection of that species. So at first I was very close to that argument. I had a defensive position, but after listening and being open to it, I thought, okay, maybe that is a valid argument. Politicians often use rhetoric. They're in the defensive position. What they're trying to do is win, right? They're trying to win votes, win positions, win power. They're not really interested in the truth always. I'm not saying that that there aren't some politicians that sometimes are very open to the other side, but often they're entrenched. And if you know what's going on in the US over the last year, there's definitely two sides that are both very, very deeply invested in their one position and not always open to considering the opposite perspective. Here's an example of a rhetoric standoff: anti-abortion and pro-abortion rights demonstrating each other at the Supreme Court. This was in 2022. And they're not there to learn about the other side. They're there to convince other people that their position is correct. And you can see various signs about defunding parent planning and the other side saying, keep it legal, keep people safe. So that there's an example of people engaging in rhetoric and not necessarily argumentation, which again we've defined as trying to get to the truth. So arguments are made up of two or more propositions, one of which is the conclusion. So I'm going to throw a lot of definitions at you over the next few slides here. It's really important you take some time to read through the textbook to understand these more thoroughly, because I'm going to give you a brief overview, but this is something that may be hard to grasp just by going through the material I've provided here on the slides. So there are two types of arguments. Deductive reasoning or deductive arguments contain a conclusion that necessarily follows from a premise, and an inductive argument, the premises provide support but not necessarily proof for the conclusion. So deductive versus inductive. So propositions are statements that express a complete thought. A proposition, it could be true, it could be false. And the conclusion of an argument is the proposition that is supported or denied on the basis of other propositions or reasons. So, also called claims, viewpoints, and positions, it is what the argument is trying to prove. A conclusion can appear anywhere in an argument. You can start with an argument, you can start with a conclusion, you can end with a conclusion. But you have to understand that all arguments contain propositions. In a premise are propositions that support or give reasons for an acceptance of an argument. Reasoning proceeds from premise to conclusion. Good premises are based on facts. Yes. So if you think of it if you want to argue something, having premises or reasons or evidence makes up a good argument. So here's the proposition: the earth revolves around the sun. In order to be an argument, a sound argument, you need two places, right? You need some evidence to support this, and those were called premises. So there's different types of premises, and this is one area you're definitely going to need to dig into a little bit more, because on the quiz and on the midterm, they're going to ask you different types to be able to identify different types of premises. In a descriptive premise are based on empirical facts, scientific observation, or sensory experience. So those are kind of evidence or reasons that are based in science. Prescriptive premises, in contrast, are value statements. Those are premises that are based on values. Analogies, analogical premises, take the form of an analogy in which a comparison is made between two similar events, and definitional premises contain a definition of a key term for the purpose of precision or clarification. So it's very important, like I said, there's going to be examples in the textbook in some more depth. It's going to be very hard to grasp it just by going over those definitions, because I'm sure this is new information to almost everyone. So non-arguments, explanations, conditional statements. So an explanation is a statement about why or something happened. It's not an argument. You're explaining something. And a conditional statement is also not an argument. A conditional statement is, if this happened, then something else will take place type of statement. Unlike explanations and conditional statements, an argument tries to prove something. Or when you're explaining something, you're not necessarily trying to prove anything. And if it's a conditional statement, you're also not trying to prove anything. So here's a conditional statement. If an 18-year-olds are emotionally mature enough to go to war, then they should be allowed to drink alcohol. I've heard this a number of times. It is a conditional statement. It is not an argument. So breaking down arguments, they're also going to go into a lot of detail about how to physically break down arguments and label them. This is something that you should have a broad understanding of, but you won't be required in a test to physically circle and underline and do that with the arguments. You might have to identify where a premise or a conclusion or an explanation is, but with the formats of the test, there'll be multiple choice and you won't necessarily have to be physically diagramming them. So bracket the propositions. Students who sit in the front of the classroom generally earn higher grades. Therefore, you should move up to the front of the class since I know you want to improve your grades. So what they've done in this argument, or what they've done here, is they've bracketed all the propositions. So proposition number 1, students who sit in front of a classroom generally earn higher grades. Proposition number 2, you should move up to the front of the class. And proposition number 3, I know you want to improve your grades, right? Here's the conclusion. So again, here's a bit more detail about diagramming and using symbols when we are looking at arguments, and they're saying a circle number is used to indicate a proposition where it appears in the argument. A broken circle is used to indicate an unstated premise or conclusion. An arrow is used to indicate the relationship between an independent premise and a conclusion. A line is used to connect the dependent premises, and a line with an arrow below it is used to indicate the relationship between a dependent premise and a conclusion. So we have an example here, right? This is how they're doing it. So if you go back to the other slide, you read the definitions again, you can see how it applies to the diagram here. Here's another example of how they break it down further. And again, you have to go back a couple slides to see how they are breaking this down. These people are burning Harry Potter books based on their conclusion that Harry Potter and witchcraft should not be practiced, right? So there are arguments, or the conclusion is witchcraft should not be practiced, and their premises are that Harry Potter is witchcraft. So therefore, we should be burning all their books. So here's another example of breaking it down. Like I said, if you click a couple slides back, you can see how they're doing it in more detail. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this today because it's not really a huge part of the course or the overall objectives. College students fighting for equity. College students are divided regarding the morality and constitutionality of affirmative action in college admissions. Again, I'm not going to get into that. It's more of an issue in the U.S., but feel free to dig a bit deeper into it if you want to, because there's more detail in the textbook. Okay, so evaluating arguments, knowing how to break down and diagram arguments makes it easier for us to evaluate them. And you're looking for 5 things when you're looking at an argument: clarity, credibility, relevance, completeness, and soundness. And if an argument is clear, it's credible, it's relevant, it's complete, and it's sound, that is a good argument. If it's missing one of these elements, it's not necessarily a sound argument. So clarity is the argument is clear and it's not ambiguous. We know this from all of our papers about credibility, right? Like, is it supported by good evidence, or did you get the information from maybe a quick Google search? Arguments may be false, absolutely. Boys become doctors, girls become nurses. If one of the premises is false, the premises do not support the conclusion, right? So there's an example of an argument that is false. Relevance, are premises relevance? So do they relate to the argument, right? I would argue that gender doesn't have much relevance in the argument of who can and who cannot become a doctor, right? There's no such thing as saying that because you're a certain gender that you're more inclined or better qualified to be a doctor. And then completeness. Are any of the statements are there any unstated premises in the conclusion? This is often the case with arguments that are incorrectly researched or have a confirmation bias. Yeah, so is the argument complete? Do you look at both sides? Or are you just focusing on one side of the issue? And if you are, then that is an incomplete argument. In soundness, are the premises true? Do they support the conclusion? A sound argument is one in which the premises are true and they support the conclusion. Constructing an argument. Once you know how to identify, deconstruct, and evaluate arguments, you're ready to construct your own. And these are 8 steps that you're going to use to help you improve the quality of your arguments. Begin by stating the issue, develop a list of premises, eliminate weak or irrelevant premises, and establish a conclusion. Organize your argument, test your argument using others, revise your argument if necessary, and if appropriate, act on your conclusion or solution. Arguments are useful tools for making real life decisions. Skilled critical thinkers employ them to recognize conflict and or diffuse it. They are also avoid jumping to premature conclusions and only take stand after studying an issue from multiple perspectives. So yes, being able to really identify what is valid and what is true and what arguments are sound versus jumping to conclusions, right? If someone were to say that the coronavirus is a conspiracy, it's a worldwide conspiracy by the pharmaceutical companies or the governments to take power or make money, some people are arguing that. What your job is to really figure out if it's based on sound evidence, if it's clear, if it is well researched, if it is a complete argument, and look at multiple perspectives before making a conclusion. Okay, so that was a brief overview of Chapter 6. You will be required to know this information for the quiz and the midterm, and then we're going to apply it later on in the course where you're going to be developing your own arguments. But like I said, this is a chapter that is hard to understand. At least some of the content is hard to understand by simply going through the lecture here. I would encourage you to do some additional research, dig in a bit deeper, and of course, ask as many questions as you would like.